Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I promised yesterday that I will discuss an extract from A Mutambara's book, where he's talking about the GNU and the 2013 Constitution. Let me say from the outset that I do salute A Mutambara for coming out with the book and making it abundantly clear, at least in the book, what went wrong during the GNU. It's a pity that most of his colleagues, even those who are still very active in politics today, have not done so. And some of them, to be quite honest, I don't expect them to, because I don't think they even appreciate what the GNU was about. I'll just read an extract from that book and give you my view of it. In this extract, A Mutambara, and I'm quoting now, my biggest regret about our participation in the GNU is that we, coming from the opposition parties, MDCT and MDCM, into government, were naive and unstrategic. We lacked the Machiavellian instinct and disposition. We honestly but naively pursued the business of running the country, salvaging the economy, and creating an enhanced socio-political dispensation. As a collective political leadership, we should have taken time to apply our minds to the existential question, what next after the GNU? We did not address this matter. This was suicidal. On the other hand, our colleagues from ZANU-PF were not interested in saving the country. They took the GNU period as an opportunity to regroup and strategize, with the objective of offloading us from the government as soon as they could. Their target was the next harmonized elections in 2018. Pew and they paid lip service to the global political agreement in the GNU. They tolerated the constitution-making process as long as it did not disadvantage them in any way. Our ZANU-PF colleagues were not interested in any of the political, electoral, national healing, security sector, and media reforms stipulated in the global political agreement. This brings me to our second shortcoming. We did not concentrate on those reforms or put them at the center of our activities right from the beginning of the GNU. While we knew these changes were critical in ensuring that the next elections were free, fair, and credible, leading to undisputed outcomes, we did not walk the talk. It was a tragic lack of judgment. We only started making uncreative noises and throwing shameless tantrums about the need for reforms towards the end of the GNU, which was to terminate on 29th June 2018. It was too late. Full marks Mutambara. I think he's one of the few who have even acknowledged that the primary purpose of the GNU was to implement the democratic reforms to ensure free, fair, and credible elections. To say that it was lack of being naive and unstrategic, I think is to put it mildly. The truth of the matter is the MDC leaders were corrupt and breathtakingly incompetent. One has got to look at what gave rise to the GNU. The GNU came about not because the economy was in serious trouble, and so they had to concentrate on reviving the economy. That is not true. Yes, the economy was in serious trouble. After all, in 2008, the country had 500 billion% hyperinflation. Inflation was so high that it was near impossible to do business. And so most of the shop shelves were empty. No one could do anything, because what is the point of giving somebody a quotation, for instance, to do a job even if you were to be paid at the end of the day, whatever you are paid in Zimbabwe dollars would be worthless, much less if it's going to be paid in end of the month or even later at that rate of inflation. Prices were changing so fast that you could pick up something from the shop shelves with a price tag on it. When you take it to the till, they will tell you that the price has changed, doubled. So there's no doubt that the hyperinflation, the economy was in serious trouble as a result of the hyperinflation, among other things. But the hyperinflation was cured by the simple act of scrapping the Zimbabwe dollar. The other significant step that revived, kickstarted the economy was the scrapping of the price controls. Those events did not require somebody to spend all their time on the economy, as others will try to argue in this case here. The very fact that the GNU was born out of an election process that was so flawed, the cheating in the counting of the votes in March was so blatant that when ZANU-PF realized they were losing, they stopped ZEC from announcing the result. They went on to recount the results. And it took 6 weeks. And of course, that is when they had the opportunity to whittle down Tsvangirai 73%, according to Mugabe's own fraudulent slip, to 47%, just enough to force the runoff. And during the runoff, they used violence that it was impossible for Tsvangirai to stay in the race. He had to withdraw, declaring that ZANU-PF had declared war on the people. So this is the reality. SADC and the AU election observers, they could not pretend this was a democratic process. And so they refused to grant ZANU-PF political legitimacy. And it was a result of that ZANU-PF was forced to go to sign the global political agreement and then to go into the GNU. So therefore, for people like A Mutambara, who were in the GNU, to say they went into the GNU to fix the economy and failed to realize it was to stop a repeat of the same blatant cheating as happened in the March vote count and the wanton violence as happened in the runoff. Is completely nonsensical. Completely nonsensical. The political problem was the main thing, was the biggest problem here. The other point here that must be also be understood is that the GNU lasted 5 years. It is unbelievable that somebody can say, oh, we were naive and unstrategic. For 5 years? You had 5 years to implement these political reforms, and you failed to realize that you needed to implement them in 5 years. And let's not forget here, the process of implementing the reforms could be initiated by any member of parliament, any member of the Senate, any of the cabinet, and the deputy prime minister, A Mutambara, at that time was the GNU, and he was one of the two deputy prime ministers, and the prime minister himself. MDC, the two parties between them, they had more than 110 members of parliament, 50 or so senators, and over 30 ministers, deputy prime ministers, and the prime minister himself. And for all of those people to do nothing for 5 years and to say it was, we were just naive, it's just ridiculous. It's pathetic. It's nonsensical. These are individuals who Mugabe knew that if he bribed them, they will forget the reforms. And that is exactly what he did. Mugabe gave these MDC leaders ministerial limos, very generous salaries and allowances. And for Morgan Tsvangirai himself, the US $4 million mansion. And of course, they forgot about the reforms. It is interesting, actually, that during that period, one could, who mixed in the ZANU-PF circles, would hear them boast, some of the ZANU-PF cronies, that MDC guys have learned to enjoy the gravy train. They're not going to rock the boat. Mazwane MDC adziza kuchika Nyerere, they posted. Of course, those cronies knew what they were talking about. After all, Mugabe had used the same strategy on them. When the country gained its independence, within a few weeks, according to Dr. Simbamakoni, Mugabe surprised his cabinet, his ministers and deputy ministers, by giving them Mercedes-Benz. Ian Smith had been running his government. His ministers were driving Peugeots. They were not allowed to take them home. From their home to the office, they drove their own vehicle. But when they are at the office, they could use the Peugeot. And when they finished, they leave the Peugeot at the office, take their own vehicle home. Mugabe changed that. Instead of the Peugeots, he gave them limos, Mercedes-Benz limos, which has become now the standard. And they were on duty 24/7. Of course, those limos had not been on the budget that they inherited from Ian Smith. And the cabinet, the new cabinet, had not approved them either. This was a present from Mugabe. This was the beginning of the patronage system. And his ministers knew what this was all about. Vakadzidza kudya vanyerere. They learned early, and they never rocked the boat. And Margaret Dongo, in sheer frustration in the 90s, was to complain that Mugabe's MPs, ministers, and all government and political ZANU-PF leaders, vakadzi vaMugabe, in sheer frustration at the way those leaders would never challenge Mugabe. And so when Morgan Tsvangirai and his gang came in, Mugabe knew exactly what he had to do. They were denied nothing. And they repaid it by not rocking the boat. We cannot deny that the democratic reforms were at the very heart of the GNU. For people like A Mutambara who understood that, and I think he's not the only one, there are others like Tendai Biti, David Coulthard, who knew and understood what the reform, the GNU was about. I have quoted sometimes Tendai Biti, what he said in an interview in 2015, expressing his frustration at the sheer lunacy of participating in elections that they knew were flawed. David Coulthard said the same thing in his book. And in all of their cases, they were arguing that people should stop participating in these flawed elections. And I'm sure they articulated those arguments to their fellow opposition members, leaders. But because these leaders were after the gravy train benefits, all those things were ignored. So in this particular case, you can see that before the GNU itself, it was clear what the GNU's primary purpose would be. During the GNU itself, it was also clear. Afterwards, when ZANU-PF continued to rig the elections, surely anybody could see that this was the problem. We had not implemented the reforms. And yet, MDC have continued to participate in these flawed elections out of greed. And therefore, then to keep on pretending as if, we were naive at the time, is totally being dishonest. You are still naive now. People are still participating in these flawed elections to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. In fact, David Coulthard, and I think it is important here, I will show you the quotation from his book, was right in let me just find it. Here it is. was right in saying that they were participating out of greed. The logical thing, the process, the election process itself, ever since the 2013, has been so flawed, so illegal, that the only logical step was to withdraw. But when he talked to his fellow members and they were not going to withdraw, he too continued participating. What is also disappointing here is that many Zimbabweans who should be the intellectuals, well qualified, well educated, have failed to understand what the GNU was all about. Even now, with the benefit of hindsight, even now with the benefit of books like what Arthur has offered, what David Coulthard have said, quotations from what Tendai BT have said, they still fail to understand what the GNU was all about. This is what is so disappointing about Zimbabweans. Whether we like it or not, ZANU-PF was able to rig the recent election in August because no meaningful reforms were implemented. Why? Because MDC wasted the one golden opportunity the country had to implement those reforms. Not only that, ever since they've been participating in these flawed elections to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. It is absolutely shocking how Nelson Chamisa, for instance, has been using the excuse, one excuse after another, to cover up for his greed. Nelson Chamisa and company have been absolutely hell-bent on participating in these elections for the purposes of greed, as David Coulthard clearly states here. But to cover for their greed, Nelson Chamisa had to come up with all manner of excuses of why they have got to participate. Some of them completely, you say to yourself, this is unbelievable. I'm not hearing this. How can somebody say that, oh, I've plugged all the loopholes, the vote rigging loopholes? And you ask yourself, how did you plug them? And surprise, surprise, he cannot tell you. In fact, it's self-evident. How can you say you've plugged all the loopholes, the vote rigging loopholes, when in reality, you have not even forced SEC to produce a verified voters roll? All the election observers in the August elections, that's the the AU, the regional body, SADC, and Zimbabwe's own Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, taxed to report on the elections. They also admitted that these August elections were flawed. And yet somebody claimed that they were going to plug all the vote rigging loopholes. And what is even more shocking is that some of the intellectuals either believed it, or if they doubted it, they did not dare say so. So they quietly endorsed that position as well. And so the nation was dragged into an election process, totally meaningless election process, knowing that by participating, you're only giving ZANU-PF legitimacy. And that's exactly what happened. And so we are now stuck with a regime that rigged the elections. All the election observer teams admitted that. But SADC itself, I believe SADC did not want to do anything about it because they still had in the back of their mind what happened in 2008 to 2013, where, according to Professor A Mutambara here, the opposition failed to implement even one meaningful reform because they were naive and unstrategic. They are still naive and unstrategic because they are still participating in flawed elections to give ZANU-PF legitimacy, knowing that doing so will give ZANU-PF legitimacy. And the people themselves, particularly the intellectuals, I come back to them because they're supposed to be the cream de la cream of the nation, have themselves been actively participating in these elections or by their silence endorsing CCC's participation in these flawed elections. SADC's position is untenable. I have to be honest. I would not have any confidence myself that Zimbabwe would have implemented any meaningful reforms, even if SADC had forced through another GNU. Because neither CCC nor the ordinary Zimbabwean, particularly the intellectuals, showed any sign that they have they've learned something from the last GNU and its failure to implement reforms. And as long as you have got this cycle, hopelessness going on, what is the point? So in this particular case, I think it is imperative that Zimbabweans come out honestly, and it is not rocket science. Accept that the GNU was important, that the GNU was our golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms which would have ended ZANU-PF, the ZANU-PF dictatorship, and put up our hands and accept that we wasted that opportunity. More significantly, Zimbabweans should understand that the failure to implement even one meaningful reform during the GNU by MDC leadership is proof that those individuals are corrupt and breathtakingly incompetent. You come to that conclusion, there is no way you can justify that CCC leaders should still be looked up to as the ones who are going to get the country out of this mess. If they fail to implement the democratic reforms when they had the golden opportunity to do so during the GNU, what hope is there of them doing it now when ZANU-PF holds all the trump cards? None. So why are you still pushing CCC as the answer? It's clear proof that you have not appreciated what the GNU was about. Life is tough. Those who do not learn the lessons, the basic lessons of this world, will be forced to repeat the lesson, to repeat the same mistake, and pay again for their mistake. After 43 years of rigged elections, we are still paying the price of flawed and rigged elections. At this rate, I really do not see any hope that at the end of the 5 years, 2028, the elections will be any different from the flawed elections that we have now. We've just had just recently. No doubt, Chamisa and company will be coming up with more promises of winning in rigged election strategies, and people will blindly believe them, participate, and then the day after the election, Chamisa will come back and say, oh, ZANU-PF rigged the elections, forgetting that they are the ones who say that they had already got the strategies to stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. So the cycle will go on. I've got at the bottom of the page the site where you can read A Mutambara's full extract, at least on this particular item of why the MDC failed to implement any meaningful reforms during the GNU. You can read the whole article for yourself. My last message on this issue is we can bury our heads in the sand and pretend that the MDC leaders have learned their lesson and they are going to deliver either free, fair, and credible elections, which I don't see how, because they've given up on reforms, or they are going to win rigged elections, which again I don't see how, given that ZANU-PF has perfected the art, and as long as it has got carte blanche powers to rig the elections, I don't see ZANU-PF losing an election that has got the carte blanche powers to rig. But if we decide we want to believe that that is going to happen as a nation, that's our prerogative. And after 43 years of rigged elections, in 5 years' time, we'll be talking about after 48 years of rigged elections, and so forth. The cycle will continue. Meanwhile, the country will drift deeper and deeper into the abyss. Do we have the courage to finally admit that the system is not working and we need to change it? What we need to change is the opposition. We should not delude ourselves that ZANU-PF will ever reform itself out of power. It will never do that. So if ZANU-PF cannot reform itself out of power, we have got to come up with how are we going to get the reforms implemented. And for that, we need an opposition that is competent, focused on those reforms. The opportunities to implement reforms have always been there. So far, the best opportunity was during the GNU, the last GNU. That opportunity can come up again. And one way of enforcing that opportunity comes up is to participating in flawed elections just to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. The answer is always staring us in the face. Just we're not willing to open our eyes to see it. And until we do, we'll be stuck with this ZANU-PF dictatorship, stuck with the failed state, stuck with the consequences of the failed state. Food for thought. Thank you very much for listening, and good night.